So last week, very early after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I called upon the International Ice Hockey Federation to immediately suspend Russia from any kind of international competition, to take away any competitions, any tournaments that were planned for Russian territory. And as of this week, they've come through on that. They've gone ahead and they've done that. So when the 2022 World Junior Championships reconvene in Edmonton later this summer, Russia will not be there. When the 2023 World Junior Championships are played, they will not be in Siberia. There will be no World Juniors in the Gulag. And that's absolutely fantastic. It was actually kind of absurd ever to think that it was ever reasonable to actually play this tournament in the place where the Soviet Union used to send their political prisoners. That was a ridiculous idea right from the get-go. And honestly, that in particular never should have been entertained. And as much as I think that it would be hilarious for me to try to claim credit for that, probably being one of the first people to come out and actually make a call for that, let's be real, the IIHF, they didn't make that decision because of me and my one bitty cannon. It probably had a lot more to do with what Wayne Gretzky had to say about the whole thing. Because when he came out and he spoke about this during his gig on TNT during one of the games, whenever that was last week, that was exactly what he said. He said that there should be no Team Russia at the World Juniors. There should be no Team Russia in any IIHF competition until further notice. And quite frankly, given the scale of what Russia is doing in the Ukraine, that should be that until further notice should be quite a long time in coming. Now, this was all no surprise. This was no surprise. Anybody who knows very much about the Gretzky family history knew that this is exactly where Wayne Gretzky was going to come down on this. Particularly, in no small measure, because one of the reasons why Wayne Gretzky was here and why he was such a great hockey player for Canada at all was because his family had come here as political refugees during the 1920s, I believe that it was, if I'm not mistaken. And basically his family came here fleeing Soviet repression. Yeah, basically they very narrowly missed Holodomor. Now, for those of you who might be historically uninitiated into this, basically what was Holodomor? Holodomor was basically, it was like the Soviet Holocaust. The Russian Soviets, they didn't like the Ukrainian farmers. They called them Cossacks. Basically, what that meant was that they were like capitalist profiteers. When really all that was really true of that was that the only thing that was true of those Ukrainian farmers is that they were very good at growing grain, and they were pretty good at managing to eke out a living on that. But the Russian Soviets, they needed somebody to, they needed a scapegoat very early on. They needed an internal enemy that they could organize people against, and they chose these Ukrainian farmers. And so they instituted a policy that basically said, you have to give this much of your grain to us every single year. And if you don't have anything left over for yourselves to eat, well, hey, bad news, you're going to go hungry. And for any Ukrainian farmers that actually tried to hold any grain in reserve so that they could feed their own families and just keep producing grain for the rest of the, for the rest of the Soviet Union, as it were, they were treated very harshly. In many cases, they were even killed in political purges. And Wayne Gretzky has always been very keenly aware of just how narrowly his family missed becoming victims to that themselves. And so as soon as Russian troops and tanks began to roll into the Ukraine, you knew that you were going to hear about Wayne Gretzky about this. And not just because it's personal to him. In part because it's personal to him and it's personal to his family. But hey, you know what? We call him the Great One for a reason. So make no mistake about this. Wayne Gretzky did speak out on this because it's personal to him and it's personal to his family. But more than anything, he spoke out because it was the right thing to do. And that's what separates the great ones from the not so great ones. And here's one who's obviously not so great, Alexander Ovechkin. So as this invasion began, Alexander Ovechkin, he was under a lot of pressure from the very beginning, and there's actually a very good reason why. And it's not just because he's a great hockey player who happens to be from Russia. If it was really about that, I don't think that the amount of pressure that's been exerted on Ovechkin to try to get him to come out against this war, I don't think it would have been appropriate. But Alexander Ovechkin, he's not just any hockey player who just happens to come from Russia. He actually happens to be one of Putin's most ardent supporters in the sporting world. Exactly how ardent a supporter is Alexander Ovechkin of Putin? Just a few years ago, Ovechkin was organizing this kind of political action committee made out of Russian athletes. They're all going to support Ovechkin in the election, pretty much in all future elections. And so as it turns out that Alexander Ovechkin, he's not just a Russian athlete who has happened to have had his picture taken with Vladimir Putin. He actually happens to be a pretty important pro-Putin organizer. And so with that in mind, on that basis alone, he would have an extraordinary amount of responsibility to come out and say the right thing about this invasion. And a lot of people seem to think that he actually did come out and say the right thing. That's not true. He didn't. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. I want to also report to you something that even I just recently learned this, and I didn't really realize that this was something that had happened. But as it turns out, that not only is Alexander Ovechkin, a very important political organizer for Vladimir Putin, he's actually somebody that has repeated a lot of Putin's rhetoric on the Ukraine. Now, as it so happens, one of the pieces of justification that Putin has offered for this invasion of the Ukraine is that he says that the invasion of Ukraine is what he calls a denazification project. And they justify that on the basis of the detail that there was actually a Ukrainian battalion, a rather large one, that enlisted with the Nazis during World War II, after the Nazis had invaded the Soviet Union. Now, make no mistake about this. When you only examine it that far, yeah, that's obviously not great. That's obviously a terrible thing. That's a terrible side to take in that war. And I don't think anybody can deny that. But the one thing that I would put forward for consideration is this, is that you have to also keep in mind that it isn't as if, like, what the Nazis were, what they were doing, all of those things was as widely known back then as it is now. And if you were if you were a Ukrainian during that era of time, your only source of information about Germany and about the Nazis would have actually been Soviet state propaganda. You have to put yourself in these people's shoes a little bit and ask yourself this question. If I was a Ukrainian whom, within living memory, had been targeted by the Soviets for genocide, and that's exactly what the Holodomor was. The Holodomor was a genocide. Make no mistake about it. But now suddenly you've got these people coming through, and they have the ability, in your eyes, to push the Soviet Union out of Ukraine altogether. And I have to say that I would understand why a lot of Ukrainians then, not really having any source of information about how obviously god-awful the Nazis were, having no source of information about that they can trust, I can see exactly why that's a deal that they might be willing to take, why that's something that they might have been willing to fight for. In hindsight, well, hindsight is always 20/20. But to assume that they were all about everything that the Nazis were about, no, I don't think so. I think that they just wanted the Nazis to be gone, and they joined up with the side that was most willing to keep them gone. And that right there is the roots of the so-called, Nazi ideology, in the Ukraine. But all the way back in 2014, Alexander Ovechkin, he went all in with Putin, on this so-called anti-fascist, basically labeling Ukraine a fascist state. he came out and he made these comments about how the Russian invasion of the Crimea, was going to help them save Ukrainian children from Ukrainian fascism. Which is basically, of course, that's a load of bollocks. And there were a lot of people who actually did call him out then, but there were moves to swiftly silence them. And as stunning as it is to have learned this, it turns out that some of the individuals that led this charge to protect Ovechkin and to silence his critics actually came from within the Washington Capitals organization themselves. So I'm going to give you kind of a brief recounting here. This is something that comes off of the Twitter account of a former Russian-born sports journalist by the name of Slava Malamud. So in his actual sports writing, Slava Malamud was very good at staying on topic and keeping his politics out of it. But on his Twitter account, he let everything fly. And so when Ovechkin came out and said that basically they were invading the Crimea to try to save Ukrainian children from Ukrainian fascism, all the way back then, he wrote the following tweet. Tonight on Epics, we will follow Washington's hockeyist Alexander Ovechkin on his daily hunt for children who may be savable from fascism. Hashtag caps. And so then this generated a response by a Capitals public relations official by the name of Kurt Kerr. And he basically just replied and said in an email, he sent an email to Slava Malamud and just said, really? And Slava Malamud, he didn't back down. He just basically said, it's like, you know what? Maybe search would have been a better word, but otherwise I'm going to stand by what I said. And Mr. Kerr, that wasn't good enough for him. And so basically what he said from that point was that, this guy, he wasn't really a journalist. He was just a smarmy fan with a Twitter account. And that they weren't going to give him any more access to Washington Capitals games, any more access to Washington Capitals players. Basically, he was blacklisted. And as it turns out, he was as good as his word. Because when a European news agency tried to contract Mr. Malamud to be their correspondent for a few games related to the World Cup of Hockey that happened to be played in Washington, they couldn't get him credentialed. They couldn't get his foot in the door. He couldn't get in the building. All because he had criticized Alexander Ovechkin for, quite frankly, something that Alexander Ovechkin should have been criticized for. And there can be no two words about that. It should not have been difficult even then to see why it was that he should have been criticized. In hindsight, looking back with a full-scale invasion of the Ukraine, hindsight is 20/20, as I said before. But even then, it was not difficult at all to figure out why somebody would want to criticize Alexander Ovechkin for the kind of comments that he made. Now, on the one hand, maybe a person could understand why it is that the Washington Capitals would want to protect their player. But there are some times that you just don't protect a player. There are some things that you just don't protect them for. This was one of them, and it was absolute moral bankruptcy that they would basically torpedo a journalist's career basically for over a snarky tweet about something that their players should have been criticized for, and they should have known that. Absolute shame on the Washington Capitals organization. They're Washington's team, but you look at the way that you look at all the iconography and all the symbolism that they use as part of their team. That team reasonably should stand for all of the same things that the United States at least says that they stand for. And for Alexander Ovechkin to have been protected for something like that by an organization that is supposed to stand for all of those things. And even now, for him to continue to be active as a part of the Capitals organization, to be a part of the hockey team of the capital city of the United States of America, while Russia is out actively trampling everything that the United States of America stands for, that's an obvious problem. And here's the thing, is that very early on, a lot of people came out and they said that, Alexander Ovechkin should have his contract suspended and he should be sent back to Russia. He should basically be deported as deported as an ally of Vladimir Putin. And there are some people that even went a step further. They said that all Russian players should have their contracts suspended. As a matter of fact, that's what Dominik Hasek had to say. And I don't really agree with that. Definitely not as it pertains to all Russian players. But I would say that if a Russian hockey player was actually a part of this Putin team that Alexander Ovechkin organized, I don't know if I'm ready to come out and say that absolutely yes, their contract should be suspended and they should be deported for at least the duration of this invasion. I don't know if I'm ready to come out and say that, but I think it's something that at least should be considered. Now, as I stated previously, there is a long history, throughout almost the entirety of the Cold War, of North American hockey teams bringing all of these Russian and Eastern European players, a lot of Czech players, a lot of Slovakian players. Even a few Russian players came over here as basically as political dissidents. They came here as refugees. But there is a world of difference between having a player here, having a Russian player on your team as a refugee during the 1980s and 1990s, even into the 1990s. There's a difference between that and being in the 2020s and having a player on your team who is basically a Russian propaganda machine. There's a world of difference between those two things. And freedom of speech being what it is, that's very important. Freedom of thought and conscience. These people have the right to make up their minds what they think about these things, and they have the right to express them. But I don't think that comes with an obligation, to have basically, a Putin propaganda puppet on your hockey roster. Now, there are some people who have said and will continue to say that Ovechkin came out and spoke out against the invasion. I'm going to be honest with you, looking at what his remarks were, what he actually said, I don't believe that to be true. I think that he made some comments that were very carefully calculated to make it seem like he was against a war, but that really all that he wanted was the war to end quickly, and for his purposes it could end in a Russian victory, and that would be preferable for him. All he basically said was no more war. I want this invasion to be over. I want it to end quickly. But at no point has he actually said that Vladimir Putin was wrong to launch that invasion. If Ovi was as great as his nickname leads everybody to believe that he is, that's exactly what he would have said. But you know what? If he was that great, he never would have been a Putin ally in the first place. And so, of course, we're forced to conclude that, Alexander Ovechkin, Alexander the Great, not so great. And then meanwhile, this guy, he's not just the great one, he's the greatest one. And all those blows that he struck against the Soviet hockey machine during the 1980s, they were only a prelude for the blow that he's striking against them now.